What started as a routine talk show conversation quickly turned into a moment no one in the studio expected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn and a normally light, promotional interview slowly becomes something more tense, more pointed, and noticeably uncomfortable for everyone watching? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. Ryan Gosling's appearance on the show begins the way viewers of daytime television have come to expect. He walks out to applause, exchanges warm greetings with the hosts, and settles into his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who has done this many times before. The audience response is enthusiastic but controlled, the kind of polite excitement that fills a studio when a familiar and well-liked actor takes the stage. Joy Behar opens with humor, referencing his latest project, and the panel laughs easily. The conversation flows smoothly at first, touching on his career, his recent press tour, and the way audiences have responded to his work. Gosling speaks thoughtfully, pausing before answers, smiling when appropriate, and keeping his tone measured and respectful. From the viewer's perspective, nothing seems out of the ordinary. The hosts lean in, listening, occasionally jumping in with brief comments or jokes. Whoopi Goldberg keeps the conversation moving, redirecting when answers run long, while Sunny Hostin nods along, preparing to add her perspective later. Joy Behar, as she often does, steers the discussion toward broader cultural themes connected to Gosling's work, making observations that move beyond the film itself. At first, Gosling follows along comfortably, acknowledging the points and offering his own interpretations. The shift begins subtly. Joy reframes one of her questions, moving away from the movie and toward what she describes as the message behind it. Her tone changes slightly, less playful and more pointed. She references public debates that have surrounded the film, particularly conversations about masculinity, gender expectations, and how male leads are portrayed in modern media. Gosling listens closely, his expression neutral but attentive. He nods once, then waits for her to finish before responding. His initial answer is careful. He emphasizes collaboration, explaining that films are made by many voices and that interpretations can vary. He speaks about the importance of letting audiences take away their own meanings, rather than imposing a single viewpoint. It's a diplomatic response, and for a moment it seems to satisfy the table. The audience murmurs softly, a few nods visible in the background. Joy, however, presses further. She follows up quickly, suggesting that actors who take on certain roles also carry responsibility for how those roles influence public thinking. Her delivery is calm but firm, and she leans slightly forward as she speaks. The camera cuts briefly to Gosling, who shifts in his seat. It's a small movement, but noticeable to viewers paying attention. He takes a breath before answering, choosing his words carefully. Gosling responds by pushing back, though still politely. He explains that he believes responsibility also lies with viewers to engage critically with what they watch. He says that portraying a character does not always mean endorsing every aspect of that character's worldview. His voice remains steady, but the pace of his speech slows, suggesting he wants to be precise. The audience grows quieter, sensing the conversation has moved into more serious territory. Joy interjects again, this time questioning whether that distinction is always clear to audiences. Her tone sharpens just enough to be felt. She gestures lightly with her hand, emphasizing her point. Gosling maintains eye contact, listening without interrupting, but his posture becomes more upright. When he speaks again, there's a noticeable firmness to his voice that wasn't there earlier. He reiterates his belief in storytelling as a space for complexity, not simple lessons, and notes that reducing characters to messages can limit meaningful discussion. At the table, reactions vary. Whoopi raises her eyebrows slightly, a familiar signal to regular viewers that the exchange is becoming more intense. Sunny glances between Joy and Gosling, preparing to step in if needed. Sarah Haynes shifts in her chair, hands clasped, watching closely. The studio audience remains quiet, attentive, with only a few scattered murmurs as points land. Joy responds with a brief laugh, but it doesn't fully lighten the mood. She says she understands his point, but argues that public figures don't get to step away from the cultural impact of their work. Her words come faster now, overlapping slightly with Gosling's attempt to reply. Whoopi steps in, gently but clearly, asking them to take turns so viewers can follow the discussion. The interruption resets the pacing, but the tension remains. Gosling thanks Whoopi and continues, now more direct. He says that pushing back against oversimplified narratives is part of why he chooses certain projects. He stresses that disagreement doesn't mean dismissal and that he values conversations like this, even when they're uncomfortable. His expression is serious, and the smile from earlier is gone. It's a moment where viewers can see the shift from promotional guest to engaged participant. The audience reacts with light applause at the end of his statement, not loud but supportive. Joy nods, acknowledging the response, but she doesn't fully concede her point. Instead, she reframes again, suggesting that perhaps the real issue is how these conversations are framed in public spaces like television. Her tone softens slightly, though the underlying disagreement remains clear. As part one of the segment continues, the hosts collectively try to balance the discussion. Whoopi summarizes both perspectives, highlighting the value in Gosling's emphasis on complexity and Joy's concern about cultural influence. This moment of mediation slows the tempo and brings the conversation back into a more controlled rhythm. Gosling relaxes slightly in his chair, though his focus remains sharp. From a viewer's standpoint, this is the kind of exchange that feels authentic to live daytime television. It's not explosive, but it's undeniably tense. Body language, pacing, and subtle interruptions all signal that something unscripted is unfolding. The discussion hasn't reached its peak yet, but the foundation has been laid. What began as a standard interview has turned into a real-time debate, setting the stage for the deeper disagreement that will continue to develop as the segment goes on. As the conversation moves forward, the atmosphere in the studio feels noticeably different from the relaxed tone at the start of the segment. The hosts are still smiling, but their expressions are more focused now, and the pacing of the discussion has slowed in a way that signals careful navigation. Ryan Gosling sits with his hands loosely clasped, shoulders squared, listening intently as the conversation shifts slightly away from his film and more toward the broader ideas Joy raised moments earlier. Sunny Hostin takes the opportunity to step in, framing her question as a bridge between the two viewpoints already expressed. She asks Gosling how he personally approaches interviews when he knows a project is likely to spark debate beyond entertainment. Her tone is calm and measured, clearly intended to move the discussion forward without reigniting tension. Gosling responds thoughtfully, explaining that he tries to remain open and honest, even when questions are challenging. He says he believes discomfort can be productive if it leads to understanding, a line that draws a few murmurs of agreement from the audience. Joy listens closely, nodding, but when Gosling finishes, she circles back to her earlier concern. She remarks that openness is important, but so is accountability, especially in a media landscape where clips travel far beyond their original context. This time, her delivery is slower, more deliberate, as if she wants to be clearly understood rather than provocative. Gosling shifts slightly in his seat again, a subtle sign that he's preparing to respond carefully. He begins by agreeing with part of her statement, acknowledging that context can be lost once a segment leaves the studio. He then adds that this is precisely why he resists reducing complex roles to simple talking points. His voice remains even, but there is a firmness underneath it now that wasn't present earlier. He looks directly at Joy as he speaks, signaling respect but also resolve. The camera briefly cuts to Whoopi, who watches the exchange with a neutral expression, hands folded in front of her. Joy replies quickly, pointing out that television itself often demands clarity, not complexity, especially in daytime formats where audiences tune in for discussion as much as entertainment. She gestures lightly toward the audience, referencing the viewers at home who may not have time to unpack nuance. As she speaks, Gosling waits, lips pressed together, nodding slightly to show he's listening. When he responds, he does so without raising his voice, but his words land clearly. He says that underestimating audiences is something he actively pushes against. He explains that viewers are capable of engaging with layered ideas, and that assuming otherwise risks flattening important conversations. There's a brief pause after he finishes, just long enough for the audience to process his comment. A small ripple of applause follows, restrained but noticeable. Sarah Haynes chimes in, attempting to soften the exchange by noting that these debates are part of why talk shows exist in the first place. She smiles toward both Gosling and Joy, suggesting that differing perspectives don't have to cancel each other out. Her interjection brings a slight lift to the mood, and for a moment, the tension seems to ease. Gosling smiles politely in response, and Joy lets out a short laugh, acknowledging the point. However, the underlying disagreement hasn't fully dissipated. Joy follows up again, this time asking Gosling directly whether he ever worries about being misunderstood when he pushes back publicly. The question is personal but not accusatory. Gosling considers it for a moment before answering. He admits that misunderstanding is always a risk, but says he prefers that risk to staying silent when he feels a clarification is needed. His answer is calm, reflective, and delivered without defensiveness. The audience responds with quiet attentiveness rather than applause, indicating they're engaged but aware of the seriousness of the discussion. The hosts exchange quick glances, silently coordinating the flow of the segment. Whoopi steps in again, summarizing Gosling's point in her own words, and then turning back to Joy to give her space to respond. It's a classic moderation move, and it keeps the conversation balanced. Joy acknowledges the summary and says she appreciates Gosling's honesty. She then reiterates that her pushback comes from a place of concern, not criticism. Her tone softens, and her posture relaxes slightly as she leans back in her chair. Gosling nods, acknowledging her clarification. He responds by saying he respects her perspective, even if they don't fully agree. This mutual acknowledgement draws a gentle reaction from the audience, a few appreciative nods visible in the front rows. Despite the calmer tone, there's still a sense that the conversation is walking a fine line. Gosling adds that moments like this are valuable because they reveal how different generations and backgrounds interpret the same media. Joy responds with a thoughtful comment about generational shifts in storytelling, and for a brief stretch, the exchange becomes more reflective than confrontational. The camera cuts between the panelists, capturing subtle reactions. Sunny's attentive nods, Sarah's relaxed posture, Whoopi's steady gaze. These visual cues reinforce the feeling that everyone at the table is invested in keeping the discussion constructive. The audience remains quiet, signaling respect for the seriousness of the moment. As part 2 draws on, the segment feels less like an interview and more like a roundtable discussion. The initial spark of tension has evolved into a deeper exchange of ideas, with Gosling more openly pushing back against the notion that actors must always frame their work within explicit moral boundaries. Joy continues to challenge that idea, but with less edge and more curiosity than before. From the viewer's perspective, this is the kind of live television moment that feels unscripted yet controlled. No one is raising their voice, but the disagreement is clear, sustained through careful language and measured responses. The hosts manage the flow, the audience stays engaged, and Gosling remains composed, even as he stands his ground. The conversation hasn't reached its conclusion yet, but it's clear that the most defining moments of the exchange are still ahead as the segment continues to unfold. As the discussion continues, there's a noticeable shift in how carefully everyone at the table is choosing their words. The earlier ease has been replaced by a more deliberate rhythm, the kind that happens when live television enters sensitive territory and no one wants to be misunderstood. Ryan Gosling remains composed, but his posture suggests he's fully engaged now, leaning slightly forward as Joy Behar introduces another angle to the conversation. Joy references past interviews and public reactions, noting that audiences often look to actors for clarity when films intersect with social issues. Her tone isn't confrontational, but it carries a quiet insistence. She points out that when viewers feel confused or unsettled by a message, they often turn to talk shows like this one for explanation. As she speaks, the studio is almost completely silent, with no audience reactions interrupting her thought. Gosling listens closely, nodding once before responding. He acknowledges that interviews play a role in shaping how projects are understood, but he pushes back on the idea that clarity must always mean agreement. He explains that sometimes his goal is to invite questions rather than answer them outright. His voice is steady, but there's a subtle emphasis on certain words, signaling where he feels most strongly. From home, viewers can sense that this is the heart of his perspective. Joy responds by asking whether that approach risks alienating audiences who want straightforward answers. She frames it as a genuine concern rather than a critique, but the implication is clear. Gosling pauses before answering, taking a brief breath. He says that discomfort isn't always a sign of failure, and that art, at its best, challenges people to sit with uncertainty. His words land firmly, and for a moment, no one at the table interrupts. The audience reaction is mixed but restrained. A few heads nod in agreement, while others remain still, processing what's being said. Whoopi watches the exchange carefully, her expression thoughtful. She steps in to clarify, paraphrasing Gosling's point for viewers and then asking Joy if that distinction addresses her concern. This moderation helps slow the exchange and gives it structure. Joy considers the question and responds honestly. She says she understands the value of challenging audiences, but worries that ambiguity can sometimes be mistaken for avoidance. Her tone is measured, and there's no sharpness in her delivery, but the disagreement is clear. Gosling responds by saying that avoidance would mean refusing the conversation altogether, something he's actively participating in right now. He gestures lightly toward the table, underscoring his point. This comment draws a noticeable reaction from the audience, a soft ripple of murmurs followed by light applause. It's not a dramatic response, but it signals engagement and appreciation for the candidness of the exchange. Gosling acknowledges the reaction with a small nod, then returns his attention to Joy. Sunny Hostin interjects again, offering a perspective about the responsibility of media platforms in framing these conversations. She suggests that the tension they're witnessing is a reflection of broader cultural debates happening everywhere, not just on this stage. Her contribution reframes the moment, widening the lens and easing the personal focus. Joy nods in agreement, and Gosling listens attentively. As Sunny finishes, Joy adds that her role on the show often involves voicing concerns she knows many viewers share. She says her pushback isn't about Gosling personally, but about representing those perspectives. Her tone softens further, and she briefly smiles in Gosling's direction. He responds by thanking her for clarifying, saying he respects that responsibility even when it leads to disagreement. The conversation becomes more fluid again, though the seriousness remains. Gosling speaks about navigating public discourse as someone whose work is widely visible, admitting that there's no perfect way to handle it. He emphasizes listening as much as speaking, a point that resonates quietly with the audience. The hosts nod along, and for a moment, the tension seems to settle into mutual understanding. However, Joy isn't finished exploring the topic. She asks one final follow-up, wondering aloud whether Gosling feels pressure to take clearer stances now than earlier in his career. The question is reflective, almost conversational, but it brings the focus back to him personally. Gosling answers honestly, saying the pressure exists but that he's learned to define his own boundaries over time. His response is thoughtful, grounded, and free of defensiveness. The camera cuts to the audience, showing attentive faces and stillness, the kind of quiet that signals people are listening closely. Whoopi glances toward the production clock, aware of time, and gently steers the discussion toward a wrap-up of this portion of the segment. She summarizes the exchange, highlighting the balance between responsibility and creative freedom that's been at the center of the debate. As Part 3 comes to a close, the mood in the studio is calmer but still serious. The disagreement hasn't disappeared, but it has matured into a respectful exchange of viewpoints. Gosling has clearly pushed back on Joy's framing without dismissing her concerns, and Joy has challenged him without escalating the tone. For viewers, it feels like a genuine live television moment, one where ideas clash but professionalism holds the conversation together, setting the stage for how the segment will ultimately resolve. As the segment continues, there's a subtle sense that everyone at the table is aware they've reached the most delicate portion of the conversation. The energy in the studio is steady but focused, the kind that comes when a discussion has gone far enough that each additional question matters. Ryan Gosling sits calmly, his expression attentive, while Joy Behar prepares her next point with visible care. Joy shifts the conversation slightly, referencing how public discourse has changed in recent years and how expectations placed on entertainers have grown heavier. Her tone is reflective rather than challenging, but the underlying theme still touches on the disagreement they've been navigating. She suggests that audiences now look to well-known figures not just for entertainment, but for guidance, whether those figures seek that role or not. As she speaks, the audience remains quiet, listening closely. Gosling responds by acknowledging the reality of those expectations. He agrees that visibility brings influence, but he draws a line between influence and obligation. He explains that while he's mindful of how his work is received, he's cautious about being positioned as an authority on issues that require broader voices. His delivery is calm, but firm, and his body language remains open, hands resting loosely as he speaks. Joy listens without interruption, then replies that she understands the distinction, but worries that stepping back can sometimes be interpreted as indifference. Her comment isn't accusatory, but it lands with weight. Gosling takes a moment before answering, briefly glancing toward Whoopi, then back to Joy. He says that indifference would mean disengaging, and that engaging in conversations like this one is part of how he shows care, even when it's uncomfortable. This exchange prompts a small but noticeable reaction from the audience, a few murmurs of agreement followed by restrained applause. Whoopi nods slightly, acknowledging the moment, and steps in to contextualize it for viewers. She notes that the tension they're seeing reflects a larger question many public figures face, and she thanks Gosling for addressing it directly. Sarah Haynes adds that these conversations often resonate with viewers because they mirror discussions happening in families and workplaces. Her tone is warm, and her comment helps humanize the exchange. Gosling smiles briefly in response, and Joy lets out a soft laugh, the first genuine release of tension in several minutes. The mood lightens just a bit, though the seriousness remains. Joy follows up by asking Gosling how he personally decides when to speak up and when to listen. The question feels less like a challenge and more like curiosity. Gosling answers thoughtfully, saying he tries to assess whether his voice will add clarity or simply add noise. He emphasizes the importance of listening to those directly affected by the issues being discussed, a point that draws quiet approval from the audience. Sunny Hostin nods and builds on that idea, discussing the balance between platform and perspective. She suggests that using visibility responsibly doesn't always mean speaking first or loudest. Joy agrees, and for the first time in the segment, the panel seems aligned. Gosling acknowledges the agreement, noting that moments of consensus can be just as valuable as disagreement. The camera captures small details that reinforce the shift. Joy leaning back in her chair, Gosling's posture relaxing slightly, Whoopi glancing around the table with a satisfied expression. The conversation begins to feel less like a debate and more like a collective reflection. The audience remains attentive, but the tension that defined earlier moments has clearly softened. Still, before moving on, Joy offers a final clarification of her perspective. She says her pushback comes from wanting transparency, not confrontation, and that she appreciates Gosling's willingness to engage without deflecting. Gosling responds by thanking her and saying he values being challenged in respectful spaces like this. His tone is sincere, and his words are met with a modest round of applause. Whoopi looks toward the camera and transitions the discussion, noting that these are the kinds of conversations daytime television is uniquely positioned to have. She signals that the segment will soon move back to lighter topics, but not before acknowledging the exchange. The hosts share brief smiles, and the atmosphere in the studio feels balanced again. As Part 4 winds down, viewers are left with the sense that the core disagreement has been fully aired. Gosling has pushed back clearly but calmly. Joy has pressed her concerns without escalating, and the panel has guided the discussion toward mutual understanding. The live nature of the moment remains evident in the pacing and pauses, but so does the professionalism of everyone involved. The segment is now poised to conclude, with the final moments set to reflect on how the conversation landed both in the studio and beyond. As the segment reaches its final moments, there's a clear shift toward resolution. The energy in the studio is calmer, the earlier tension replaced by a sense of closure that often follows a meaningful live discussion. Whoopi Goldberg takes the lead, signaling that time is running short and gently steering the conversation toward a wrap-up. Her tone is warm and steady, reminding viewers that the show thrives on open dialogue, even when perspectives differ. Ryan Gosling offers a brief closing thought, thanking the panel for the conversation and acknowledging that discussions like this are important, even when they're challenging. His delivery is relaxed, and his expression reflects relief as much as sincerity. Joy Behar responds in kind, saying she appreciates his willingness to engage and clarifying that her pushback was never personal. The exchange feels genuine, and the mutual respect is evident. The studio audience responds with sustained but moderate applause, the kind that signals appreciation rather than spectacle. The camera cuts across the room, capturing faces that appear thoughtful and engaged. Some audience members nod, others smile, and a few exchange quiet comments with neighbors. It's clear the discussion has landed in a way that feels substantive without crossing into discomfort. Whoopi thanks Gosling again and transitions smoothly into promoting his project, briefly reminding viewers why he's there while acknowledging the broader conversation that unfolded. The shift back to promotion feels natural, a return to the show's familiar rhythm after a serious exchange. Gosling smiles, offers a final wave, and the segment ends on a composed note. After the episode airs, reactions begin to surface almost immediately. Viewers take to social media to share clips and commentary, with many praising the calm, respectful tone of the discussion. Some applaud Gosling for pushing back without becoming defensive, while others side with Joy, appreciating her insistence on accountability and clarity. A number of comments highlight the host's ability to manage the conversation without letting it spiral. In follow-up discussions, media outlets note the segment as an example of productive disagreement on daytime television. Analysts point out how the exchange reflected broader cultural conversations about influence, responsibility, and artistic freedom. Both Gosling and Joy are described as measured and professional, with attention given to how neither attempted to dominate the conversation. On the next day's show, the panel briefly revisits the moment, with Whoopi emphasizing that respectful debate is part of what keeps the program relevant. Joy reiterates her perspective, while also acknowledging the value of hearing directly from guests who challenge her views. The tone remains reflective, reinforcing that the discussion was never meant to create conflict, but to explore ideas openly. From a viewer's perspective, the segment stands out not because of raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but because of its realism. It unfolds the way live television often does when conversations evolve beyond their original intent. The pacing, the pauses, and the subtle shifts in tone all contribute to a moment that feels authentic rather than manufactured. As the coverage settles, audiences continue to share opinions, debating the points raised and appreciating the opportunity to see thoughtful disagreement modeled on screen. The segment becomes a reference point for how talk shows can handle sensitive topics without sacrificing civility or depth. And as this narration comes to a close, the final takeaway is clear. The exchange between Ryan Gosling and Joy Behar wasn't about winning an argument, but about engaging honestly in a public space. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.